Wow. Am I on the air? I'm on. Thank you for this great honour and privilege to stand here in front of you today and share my testimony. My testimony starts with the earliest memory of God. That was when I was 4.5 years old, and I was a very sick little girl with meningitis. My parents had rushed me to the Nelson Hospital, and I was pumped full of penicillin, and I was basically in a medical coma. The doctors told my parents that they'd done everything that they could do, and if there was anyone that could pray, get them in. So my parents got my nana to come in, and she prayed over me. She was a Catholic at the time, and she had her rosary with her. God heard her prayers, and he answered them. And actually that rosary is around my neck in that photo. I woke up the next morning, and I found a blue rosary with Jesus on a cross under my pillow where my nana had left it. I have some vague memories of being in the hospital and my recovery, but the strongest memory is more of a deep knowing that God was with me and he had his hand on my life. My childhood was a happy one. I grew up for most of it in the outer Pelorus Sounds, and I free-ranged it on the steep hills and out on the sea. I lived a never-ending adventure of fishing, hunting, hut building, correspondence schooling with my loving parents, 2 brothers and my sister Debbie. Although I was brought up in a family that didn't have a Christian faith, I just knew deep down I believed in God. One year I even dedicated my diary to God. It's my way of praying each day. Teenage years hit hard, and I was a natural rebel. I pushed boundaries constantly, and my mouth got me into a whole lot of trouble. One day, after yet another fight with my poor mum, I remember my dad taking me aside. "Joe, your biggest problem is you just don't know when to zip it." Well, at nearly 50 years old, I'm still struggling to learn that lesson. At 15 years old, I was selected to go on a student exchange. And me being me, and wanting the total shock factor, I chose Brazil. My poor parents. Now, as a mum of teenagers and young adults, I can fully appreciate the grey hair that I must have given them. In 1991, aged 16, I lived in a northern Brazilian city called Fortaleza. I struggled with the culture shock and homesickness. Brazilian life was so tough. There were hungry street kids begging, homeless families living in cardboard boxes beside the roads. Coming from a sheltered, isolated life in the Pelorus Sounds to Brazil left me totally overwhelmed. I also got very angry with the religious hypocrisy which divided the rich and poor societies. Without telling my host family, I would often catch a bus down into the city and hang out with the poor. On one of my adventures, I met up with some American Christian missionaries who were in the city helping the poor. I was inspired by their faithful hearts, but when I went back to meet up with them again, they'd disappeared. Most likely moved along by the corrupt military police. Through all of these dangerous times, I can now look back and realise that God protected me and then brought me home safely. There were terrible things that were happening in Brazil during that time. The corrupt military police were constantly rounding up, and there were reports of even shooting street kids and homeless people. On my very last night in being in Brazil, I snuck out of my host family's home and attended a large street nightclub with a Brazilian friend. These street nightclubs were mainly attended by the poor. While we were dancing, the police suddenly arrived and started attacking the crowd with machine guns and riot gear. They started attacking us all, and my friend climbed up a street light pole to look out over the crowd, and she saw what was happening. She then jumped down, took my hand and shouted, "Run." This is probably the only time in my life I've actually ran, and I literally ran for my life. Somehow, in amongst all the other people who were also running, my friend flagged a taxi down. We got in, I got back to my host family's house, and then only a few hours later, I was on the plane to fly back to New Zealand. It was a miracle. My year in Brazil was finally over. After Brazil, I was very confused and angry. Suddenly a world of drugs and alcohol took over. The next few years, as I tried to settle back into a Kiwi way of life, they were very rough and I was very lost. The things I saw in Brazil broke my simple childlike faith like a shattered mirror. I didn't have the skills or the experience, the help and guidance that I needed to navigate those waters. I was in a deep, dark valley, and I felt terribly alone. I met Nick, my first husband, in 1995. He was as lost, hurt, broken, and angry at life as I was. But we began to build a life together on that common ground. During this time, a special young woman also came into my life. I actually filled her job at the Nelson Hospital Laundry while she was on maternity leave with her first child. When she came back to work, I was kept on and we got to work with each other. Her name is Angela Taylor, and as a young Christian woman, she began to sow precious seeds of faith during our conversations. Our friendship became a friendship that has lasted to this day. Once Nick and I were married in 1997, we moved to Australia to travel and live. It was a challenging few years living away from family, but we worked hard and we saved, and we finally got our new home built. We were building a life in the northern suburbs of Brisbane, and in the year 2000 I became pregnant. September 2000 and my life was turned completely upside down. It began with Nick and I doing some landscaping in our backyard. I was 8 months pregnant with our daughter, and I was sitting in the shade watching my 25-year-old husband work. Suddenly, after having a cold drink, he coughed and banged his chest. "Ouch," he said. "That went down the wrong way." The next morning, being Monday, he got up, kissed me goodbye, and headed off to work as usual. I had no idea how sick he was until he arrived home that night. His face was as grey as concrete. We rang the medical centre and got him in a doctor's appointment, and then the rest of the week saw us in and out of many medical appointments. Friday came around very quickly. Nick had an echocardiogram appointment booked at the local hospital, so he kissed me goodbye as usual, told me he loved me, and he drove off to the appointment by himself. This was the last time I heard his voice, the last time he hugged and kissed me, the last time I heard him say those precious words, "I love you." I stayed at home. I was exhausted from the busy week, so I had a wee nap. At 4 p.m. on the dot, I was woken by two things: a frantic pounding on my locked front door and the phone ringing. I got up and answered the phone and unlocked the door at the same time. My neighbour from across the street was at the door. She later told me she'd been sitting in her garage when suddenly she had this incredible, overpowering voice tell her, "Go to Joe right now." She got such a fright, she jumped up and ran across the street and started pounding on the front door. On the phone was a very nervous-sounding young female voice. She hesitantly told me that my husband had had a major heart attack. And she didn't know if he was alive or dead. The hospital staff were trying to save him. At first I thought it was a prank phone call, and my neighbour actually grabbed the phone off me and she started yelling into it. Everything became very blurry and moved in slow motion. My sister Debbie, who was also living in Brisbane with her husband, met me at the hospital, and together we got told what was actually happening to my young husband. Nick had had an aortic dissection because of an undetected health defect in his heart. That heart that had loved me so deeply was slowly dying throughout the whole week. Right from when he first experienced that sudden chest pain, that aorta had started to slowly tear. Throughout all the tests and even an overnight hospital admission during the week, this had been totally overlooked, missed completely. The surgeons worked well into the night and they saved his damaged heart. But due to the sudden full rupture that afternoon while he was having his echocardiogram, the blood had stopped pumping for about 20 minutes. And my young husband, who was about to be a daddy in 6 weeks' time, was brain dead. Just like that, my life as I knew it was over. 4 days later, life support machines were switched off. I'd lost my husband, my new home, and my Aussie life was packed up into removal boxes and shipped back to New Zealand. I came home with a big pregnant tummy and a box of my husband's ashes. I was 25 years old. The brain is a funny thing. When something big like grief happens, everything suddenly goes into like a protection mode. I was in this sleeping bag of numbness. My sister Debbie and her husband came home with me, and then Debbie stayed on here in Nelson, looking after me, and then 6 weeks later, alongside the rest of my family, we welcomed my beautiful daughter, Mackenzie Amber Nicole. On the day she was born, it was like the sun came out. I had a reason to pull myself together, and I buried my grief as much as I could so I could be a mum to this precious baby. She filled some of the emptiness in my heart that losing Nick had left. She brought a smile to my face, and life needed to be lived. But that level of grief and pain doesn't just go away with a band-aid. It bubbled deep down, breaking through every so often. Then 1 year later, September 2001, I woke up to the news of the terrorist attack in New York. The images on the TV of wives crying because their husbands had gone to work, never to return home, triggered inside of me a massive wave of grief, pain, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The temporary band-aid was ripped off and I was bleeding. The darkness swept in and left me lying in a valley of unimaginable grief and heartbreak. In a deep, dark valley, but not alone. Most definitely not alone. And how do I know this with absolute certainty? God, ever so faithful, was right there beside me. Because that is when those wee seeds of faith, sown a number of years beforehand, started to sprout. I spent many hours pouring out my heart to Angela Taylor. She very gently administered God's love to that raw pain. And unknown to me at the time, she had Radio Rema listeners praying for me. And my eyes slowly lifted upwards towards God. I learned about Jesus and how he had died on that cross for my sins so I could have this personal relationship with our Father God. And it wasn't long before Angela brought me along here to the Richmond Baptist Church. I also started seeing a Christian counsellor, Christine Rutledge, here at church. She taught me about the waves of grief, and I began the healing process. A quote I read recently says, "Grief never ends, but it changes. It's a passage, not a place to stay. Grief is not a sign of weakness, nor a lack of faith, but it's the price of love." Becoming a Christian some 22 years ago wasn't a ticket to Easy Street. Some days I felt my struggles were just so big, too big. But as I walked that road in those early days, I began to realise that my faith was like a slow-burning, comforting fire. Jesus is my comforter, my safe space, and my healer. Then God revealed his next big plan for my life. Throughout those early days of me coming to church here, unbeknown to me, my future husband was literally sitting a few rows behind me, over in that corner, because everyone faced that way. And in October 2003, he brought us together. Once again, Angela Taylor comes into the story, this time along with her sister, who is married to Mark's brother. And between them all, they arranged for us to meet at a picnic lunch on Rabbit Island. Yes, our first date was a Watson family affair. I took one look at this tall, handsome man and thought, oh my goodness, what is wrong with him? He should have been snapped up and married off long ago. But he was a fussy fella, and he'd been praying for many years for his ideal future wife. And he ended up with me. God sure does have a sense of humour. In May 2004, Mark and I were married, and he became daddy to a beautiful daughter. Life was very good. Oh, for sure, there was the usual newlywed drama or two, a few plates of food thrown, a few doors slammed. The poor man had not only gained a strong, stubborn wife, but a strong, stubborn daughter as well. In 2005, God blessed us with our first son, Samuel Leslie Michael. And in 2007, God blessed us with our second son, Jonathan Harry Leonard. Jono. Life was so good, but we were in our early 30s and we were both bored with our suburban life in a minivan. Adventure was calling us. So in 2008, we packed up our suburban life. We sold the minivan, rented out our house, and headed to Australia with 3 children to go on the road trip of a lifetime. And we spent the next 2 years driving more than 60,000 kilometres around Aussie, working on outback stations and homeschooling the children. We lived an unconventional life while making life-changing memories. Life was so good. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't without challenges, but it was an adventure. Mark and I had to rely on each other, work together, and we become a solid team. During these travelling days, we remained faithful, but with isolation and frequent moving, it meant putting down roots and attending church wasn't happening on a regular basis. We were living on the mountaintops, enjoying the views and God's plentiful blessings. Then one day in early 2010, I was suddenly pregnant with baby number 4. Well, this wasn't quite the plan, and we were going to have to make some changes to our travelling lifestyle. So as the pregnancy progressed, we began making plans to return to Nelson. In the meantime, my nana back here in New Zealand had named our baby Ruth. She was positive it was going to be a girl, and she felt that the name Ruth was suited to this travelling family. On March the 11th, 2010, on wee Sam's 5th birthday, we drove 2 hours to Port Lincoln to spend the day celebrating our gorgeous wee 5-year-old and also to have our 3-month scan. The children and Mark all excitedly hovered around the screen, waiting to see the new addition. It was the look on the poor ultrasound technician's face that told me something was wrong. Her eyes met mine, and I managed to ask Mark to take the children out. Our baby Ruth had died, gone many weeks before, and I just hadn't miscarried. I tried to pull myself together to enjoy McDonald's and the aquatic centre to celebrate Sam's birthday, but it was totally all Mark that held us together that day. He was incredibly strong. I, on the other hand, was a mess. Why, God? Am I not a good enough mother? I felt I'd failed this precious wee life that was depending on me. Against medical advice, I made Mark take me all the way back out to the farm. I was convinced they'd gotten it wrong. Oh God, where are you? I'm in this valley, are you here? A week later, the rural GP convinced Mark and I needed to go to a much larger South Australian hospital for a procedure to complete the miscarriage. That night, after the procedure, I left the hospital with a teddy bear and a handmade quilt. Gifts that are presented to parents after losing a baby. Our plans were in a mess, and Mark and I were unsure on what to do next. Then we finally decided we would still return home to New Zealand in the June 2010 after a 2-month final road trip up into the Northern Territory and WA. The final road trip helped us refocus our plans and make some more wonderful memories with the children. Coming home to New Zealand was harder than I could have imagined. I had a massive post-traumatic stress disorder flare-up. The memories of coming home from Aussie in 2000 with a box of ashes, and then in 2010 with a teddy bear and a quilt. But life was busy, and we settled back into our house and our suburban lives once again. The furniture hadn't changed, but we sure had. We settled back into church, the Hope Community Church. It was good to get back into a routine and Christian fellowship as I continued to homeschool the children. And in the May 2011, God blessed us with our third son, Elijah Daniel Malcolm. And then shortly after that, in August 2012, God blessed us with our fifth child, our gorgeous daughter, Elizabeth Grace Ann Alva. We were so blessed. In late 2012, we left Nelson yet again on another adventure. We moved to Ashburton, where God blessed us with a new church family at the Ashburton Baptist Church, and where we met this amazing pastor, Pastor David, and his wife, Jeanette. I loved my new home, my church family, the church, and my faith grew. For the first time in my faith walk, I believed that I was growing and flourishing. It would be a frantic mission to get 5 children and a husband fed, dressed, and out the door for church every Sunday morning. I remember one service where Pastor David asked the congregation, "Who is God?" Well, nobody answered. So he asked again, "Who is God?" Much to Mark's and my horror, Elijah, aged 2, yells out for all to hear, "My dad!" Life was so good. But then, early in 2013, disaster struck once again. Once again, I was back in a valley. We were back in a valley. But this time, I had to try and be the strong one for my husband. He had had a serious work accident and had cut the top off 2 fingers in a farm machine. Don't worry, that photo's not going up. What followed after that accident was a long 2-year battle. where the enemy ran through our lives like a devouring lion. It was like a wrecking ball had been swung through our home, our finances, and our marriage. The valley we were in was a battlefield, and relationships were left broken. Our marriage was broken. Hearts were battered and bruised with harsh words. But we were not alone in that battlefield. We had amazing, strong Christian prayer warriors with their shields up. God brought in all the people, family and friends who we needed to help us get through this awful dark time. And what can only be God and his answer to desperate prayers, we both began the healing process. Forgiveness. This was huge. But to move forward, we had to forgive each other as we've been forgiven in Christ. Gentle words and gentle hearts were needed and treasured. A commitment to the vows we made before God in 2004, for better or for worse. If our marriage was left up to us to fix in our own strength, then neither of us would be standing here before you all today. So we know without a doubt that God was with us and answered all those prayers. In 2015, we decided to head off on another adventure. Yes, that is Jono on top of that sign. This time we ended up on a beautiful Southland sheep and beef station, situated about halfway between Invercargill and Queenstown and about 40 k's out of Gore. Our rural lifestyle was everything we loved. Hunting, camping, 4x4 driving, boating on the southern lakes, and daily adventures on the farm. We lived a free-range, wholesome life. After the previous 2 years of being in survival mode, it was a breath of very fresh and at times very cold air. And this was the ideal place to heal hearts and repair relationships. Life was so good. I believed we'd been brought through those dark years, those valleys, those trials, those heartbreaks and those losses, and it was all finally behind us. But as we settled into this cosy contentment, hot chocolates and marshmallows on the outside fire kind of contentment, my faith began to weaken. Without even realising it, my faith began to trickle away, like what happens in the bath, to the water in the bath with the faulty plug. The memory of 2 years of battle, shoulder to shoulder with praying Christian warriors, while pressing into what was a rock-solid relationship with God, was fading and becoming distant. All the valleys I had come through, with God right beside me, each and every time was like someone else's story. Did all that stuff really happen to me? To us? Life was busy but good. We still had our challenges. After all, we were still raising 5 children and all the chaos that day-to-day life throws in. But during these years, and I was also diagnosed with 2 lifelong diseases, endometriosis and lipedema. February. Oh, I got that photo last time too. It was just us at the end of 2019. February 2020, and the world was poised on the edge of a global pandemic cliff. That unknown valley stretched out in front of the world and was huge and unfamiliar. And then one morning, the month before the first lockdown, I was in the shower and I found a lump in my left breast. My feet went over the edge of my own cliff and I found myself in yet another valley. Dark, scary and no horizon in sight. I stood under that warm water and sobbed, "No, God, not after all I've been through." Off I went to see my rural GP, who was concerned enough to refer me through to Invercargill Hospital for an urgent mammogram. Then suddenly we were flung into a pandemic nightmare of lockdowns, teaching children at home, buying air fryers and making bread. The hospital made a huge mistake of triaging my urgent mammogram into routine screening. And I was left out in the cold for over 5 months before I finally got my urgent mammogram. The lump grew rapidly during that time, and I knew it wasn't good. But I pretended I was strong enough to deal with it, and it was only those very close to me who could see just how anxious and scared I really was. Mammogram day, 31st of July 2020, Mark was standing looking at the screen while the images were being taken, and he could clearly see what wasn't meant to be there. Suddenly we were then ushered through into another room. The radiologist came in, initially jovial and smiling, and he began the ultrasound. The smile faded from his face as he began to move the ultrasound under my arm and up my neck. I was confused. Why was he ultrasounding under my arm and up my neck for a breast lump? Finally he sighed and he took Mark's hand in my hand and looked at us. It was an awkward hand-holding moment. And he said, "It's extremely serious, I'm afraid, and we need to do punch biopsies right away." He got up to go and get what he needed for these biopsies, and I looked at my worried husband and I said, "I think I'm in trouble." A week later, on the 6th of August 2020, Mark and I were called back into the hospital to see a breast surgeon and a breast care nurse. They both looked incredibly serious. And I heard the words no one ever wants to hear. "I'm sorry, Joe, but you've got breast cancer. You have an 11 centimetre tumour and about 6 lymph nodes that also have cancer. We need to remove your left breast and then get you into chemotherapy and radiation as quickly as possible." I knew in my heart that it was going to be bad news, but the reality of it was like a slap across the face. I was destroyed. I was exhausted, and I was angry. God, how could you allow this? After everything that I've had to endure, to fight for over the years, now this. God, I am so angry with you. My heart hardened. Obviously, he did not love me. I was trapped in my very lonely, dark valley. Mark and my family and friends tried their best to encourage me to be positive, but I was in a dark place. And that's when God stepped in again, because he was right there beside me as I threw my pity party. And he sent probably the only 2 people that I would have listened to at that time. Pastor David and Jeanette drove 1,000 k's from Nelson to Southland. And when they arrived, Jeanette jumped out of the car, hugged me and told me, "It's a very long way to come and tell you that God loves you." In that moment, the actual real witness of what God's love really looks like in real life was like an earthquake that shook the valley, and my heart softened. Over the next few days, they administered God's love to both Mark and I and the children. It was this time that God used them to strengthen and prepare us for what was to come. Instead of being angry and bitter, my heart softened, and instead I become grateful and thankful. Thankful for a loving God who remained faithful even when I was not. And because my faith is in Jesus and I've been saved, I win no matter how this cancer thing goes. Thankful for my huge cheer squad, family and friends who got in beside me, beside us, with practical, financial and prayer support. I was and I am so incredibly blessed. God's love in real life action. In September 2020, 7 long months after finding that wee lump, I had my first mastectomy surgery. The surgery was long and the initial recovery was a roller coaster. The first time I saw my new body in the hospital bathroom mirror, I actually fainted from the shock of it. I was left weak and struggling with drains and huge wounds stretching across my chest and under my arm. These ugly wounds were promptly named my shark bite. A week after my surgery, we met with my surgeon with the results from the pathology. My breast care nurse sat in with the appointment once again, and I knew it was serious because of the tears in her eyes. The surgeon gently explained the grim news. Things were much worse than originally thought. The tumour that he had removed had rapidly grown into a 14 centimetre tumour. And this was actually made up of 3 invasive tumours. It had grown very close to my chest wall. And there were actually 29 extensively diseased lymph nodes. And they had spread outside of the nodes into surrounding tissue. The lymph nodes had metastasised. I was officially diagnosed with stage 3C breast cancer because the metastasis hadn't reached major organs. It was bad. It was really grim. We left that appointment shocked and quiet. It was very scary. 2 weeks later, we were in the oncologist office in Dunedin. She was very blunt. All the treatment, the brutal surgery, followed up by 6 rounds of a very aggressive chemo, which literally took me to the brink of death. Then being nuked with radiation for 1 hour every day for 15 days. Then followed up by a grueling daily drug regime. All this together would give me a 13% chance of remaining cancer-free for 5 years. 13%. Mark and I were so shocked, we actually started laughing and joking with each other. The oncologist told us off like a school principal tells off a naughty student. "I don't think you're taking this seriously enough," she growled. Mark and I nicknamed my oncologist Doom and Gloom. But to this day, I'm incredibly thankful for this amazing oncologist. Well, I took a deep breath and I decided, well, someone has to be in the 13%. It may as well be me. 4 years later, here I am, hanging out in that 13%. Praise God. Now, I'm not going to stand here and downplay the brutal recovery over the past 4 years. People around me know how much I struggle with mental health, chronic pain, lung issues, fatigue, brain fog, neuropathy in my hands and my feet, headaches, eye issues, hot sweats, and digestive issues that cause excessive bloating and weight gain. All of this on a daily basis. Just this year alone, I've already endured 5 lung infections and a kidney infection, as well as a second mastectomy surgery. The drugs I had during chemo and the daily drugs I'm still on have rapidly progressed my lipedema disease, and now I battle to keep moving so I don't lose my mobility. August 2022, Mark had finally convinced me that we needed to move home to Nelson, to be nearer family and friends, to come home to this church and David and Jeanette. Up until that point, I had been stubbornly clinging onto the hope that I would get well again and go back to our pre-cancer rural lifestyle of adventures. Sadly, this hadn't happened, and it was time to come home. And thankfully, we did. Over the course of 2022, Mark had been having his own health issues. And the notorious Southern DHB, who have cost me my own life, had declined his colonoscopy 3 times. His new GP here in Richmond referred him straight to a local bowel surgeon, and within 3 months of our move back here to Nelson, he had been diagnosed with bowel cancer. This was yet another moment of total disbelief. I burst into tears when his bowel surgeon told us the news. I couldn't believe the person I loved most in this world could possibly be going through the same brutal treatment that I've been through. Our poor children. 2 parents now diagnosed with cancer. Another valley, another battle, more prayers. Oh God, hear our hearts. In December 2022, Mark underwent major bowel surgery and a large section of bowel and the cancer was removed. Thankfully, the cancer was found early and it was still enclosed, so no further treatment was required. After a second surgery earlier this year, my husband is recovering and living with his own battle scars. I just want to pause here for a minute to honour my husband, Mark. He has been a cancer patient caregiver and then a cancer patient. He doesn't say much, unless it's about diggers, hunting, sport, or Shane van Gisbergen. Did I pronounce that right? But this stoic man has had his battles, his trials, and he's had to face his fears. I am a very blessed woman to have this man in my life. Thank you, babe. So today, here I am, a broken body, but I am here. However, up until a few months ago, I was still struggling with this old mindset. I'll get my life back on track and get back to church more regularly when I get back to what my life used to be like before cancer. But 4 years on in this valley, with this life with cancer on pause status, it's not looking like what my life used to look like. That's a tongue twister. A few months ago, I was suddenly convicted that it was time to get myself and my children firmly planted back into regular church. Doing life out there, doing it in my own strength, was tough. I felt trapped on the hamster wheel and I wasn't getting anywhere. And God spoke to me very clearly. It was time to stop making excuses. I'm not a victim. And this was the first sermon I heard when I got back to church. So, maybe I'm actually exactly where God wants me. Right here, right now, I'm living in this valley, learning to trust Him no matter what. Learning that there's actually more to this life than how I look and how I feel in the moment. Learning to put how I feel aside and really listen to other people's stories and how I can be a blessing to them. Is there more to being faithful than just crying out to him when I'm in the deep, dark valleys, scared and hurting? And then often forgetting to thank him when I'm feeling content and enjoying his blessings on the mountaintops. I look back over this story and I still cannot believe the valleys I've travelled through to get here where I stand today. But there is one thing I have realised in these difficult days, is that God is the same God in each of those valleys. He has remained faithful even when I was not. He's answered prayers that might not have been the answer I wanted, but answers nonetheless. God has placed the right people in my life, in our lives, at the exact right time. Perfect timing. His perfect time. I have received so many blessings and I am so thankful for the abundance. One of my favourite songs by For King and Country, the lyrics say, "Let my life be the proof of your love." So God, please let my life be the proof of that love. This has ignited inside of me a deep desire and excitement to share my story, to share my faith, to share what God's love looks like in real life. So I'll keep on meeting God in the valley and on the mountaintops, because he is my God, he's a good God, and I love him. Thank you so much, everybody.